Okay. This is the bit that throws me off every single time. Everyone can see slides? Yes, okay, excellent. Hi, I'm Rhiann. I work with the Scottish Learning Disabilities Observatory, based in Glasgow at the University of Glasgow's Health and Wellbeing Institute. I'm going to talk to you today about the Research Voices project, which is an adaptive citizens' jury for people with learning disabilities that we ran here in Scotland. I normally co-present with one of our group members, but I wasn't able to do that today. So in the event that that happens, the group has sort of come up with the group in our own words, to introduce themselves. So I think what's important to take from there, in their own words, is that this is a group that values the difference between them. So some go to school, some go to work, some are parents, lots of different age ranges. So we've got from 16 to 66 years old within our group. They want you to know how hard they worked on their citizens' duty, how much they learned, and how well they get along with each other, and the fact that they work as a big team and have a big heart and feelings, and that their different experiences are the way that they help each other and how much respect they've got. This is last year's Christmas party. This year's Christmas party was decidedly more Zoomy, and was, you know, an absolute riot trying to get a sing-along going, but it was great. I wanted to just touch on language. We use people with learning disabilities to describe the population we work with. You might have heard people with learning difficulties or people with intellectual disabilities. We largely talk about people with learning disabilities within this project. Now, there are mild, moderate, severe, profound learning disabilities. Every person has different strengths, different support needs. But the key elements of having a learning disability are that learning takes longer. A person might have needed more support in school to learn, but likely needs additional support in their day-to-day life. Some definitions require that someone has an IQ of less than 70. We didn't for this project, and that's largely because not all people with learning disabilities have a diagnosis of learning disabilities, particularly our older generation who weren't able to be diagnosed as younger people. The context for this particular project was that we recognise that people with learning disabilities have huge health inequalities, and they face barriers to engagement in research that seeks to address those health inequalities. So it's a kind of double inequality there. The Scottish policy context really outlines a drive for active citizenship in Scotland for disabled people, and particularly people with learning disabilities. And the Observatory, where I work, has been tasked as part of that policy agenda of coming up with a programme that reflects people with learning disabilities and their families and their wishes. The issue there is that we know so little about what people with learning disabilities want from health research and what's important to them in the world of health research. So this project was really about understanding more for ourselves and for Scotland and the wider agenda. What do people with learning disabilities want from us? We had big lofty aims, but largely we wanted to understand the view of people with learning disabilities in health research. We wanted to challenge some barriers that stops people from getting involved in deliberative democracy and engagement and research, and we wanted to test a new method and share the learning from that new method, that being the citizens' jury. The question we started with is deliberative democracy inclusive currently? And a lot of the challenge of that lies within this idea that we're trying to represent the ordinary citizen, and who is that ordinary citizen? And is our group excluded from that sort of picture that we hold in our head of ordinary citizenship? And often they are. There's definitely some movement towards including disabled people in deliberative democracy, but people with learning disabilities are largely still excluded from that group. We were inspired by the Connected Health Cities citizens' jury, which was on the acceptability of planned and potential uses of health data, because it was so complex and so interesting and so difficult. And it started this conversation of, I wish we could get into some of that complexity with our population. What would that look like? Loads of academic research and debate on it, well worth a read if you're a nerd like me. There are lots of barriers to participation in any sort of engagement or deliberative democracy for our population. So the first being attitudinal, the assumptions we make about the capacity of people with learning disability and their ability, as well as their appetite to participate. They're structural, so the challenges in engaging people in systems that are largely not designed for them. These systems are complex and burdensome and actually have quite an administrative aspect that is a structural barrier. The role of gatekeepers, so we often have to reach people with learning disabilities through gatekeepers, so that could be family members, carers, providers of care, social workers. And that gatekeeper is an issue because they don't always facilitate that access. They might not always value the access. Communication is definitely up there, and there's limitations in different communication needs in any population, but those needs tend to be higher within this population. So we work closely with an organisation called Talking Mats, which is a communication enhancement tool that uses visual communication to structure conversations. So we use visual symbols to help us to structure the way we talk to each other and listen to each other. That was very helpful for us. And the wider experience of inequality for this group is massive. So there's a lack of confidence and disenfranchisement from this population that's huge and shouldn't be underestimated. So it's a population that largely doesn't get asked about their thoughts, and that kind of means that that's a barrier to participation in itself. Why do you want to hear from me? What can I offer you? It's potentially the first time they've been treated with respect. A juror said it perfectly: for us to get involved in anything, the gap is too wide. And notice that that's not we can't do it, it's that the gap between this system and my life is too wide. I need some support to bridge that. So that's what we've tried to do. There's also huge challenges in recruitment and selection for this group. They're unlikely to be recruited through random selection. They've got low voter registration, and market research organisations largely lack reach there. We might not just pick them up as we go. We would need to thoughtfully and purposefully find that group. Recruitment information about citizens' duties and deliberative democracy and engagement processes is largely not accessible. So we don't use Easy Read in the first instance. We don't value going out and doing presentations, and often there's not video content that can be used or audio content that can be used. We also need to develop these clear and accessible consent processes. So if people want to be involved, they need to understand what it is they're getting themselves into and what it is they can expect from the process. And if that's not accessible, we cannot expect to fairly recruit people into these processes. So almost every single step in that initial phase needs to be accessible. You'll notice I've kind of outlined who we managed to recruit. We were looking for a group of 12. We did initially recruit 12, but 3 fell away, which we thought was a good sign because it meant that people were understanding the consent process and that they could leave the project. We had a little bit of overrepresentation of younger people, 16 to 24, a little bit of underrepresentation of our 45 to 54 group, but overall we had a really good age range and gender mix. And that's because we used really purposive and active recruitment. We went out and had the same conversation over and over again with people, and we didn't just, here's an information sheet and Easy Read. It was really about us going to groups that had an interest in this area and gaining a little bit of trust from those groups to be able to keep on going out and out and out and having that conversation. So I met every juror at least twice before they even consented to join the process. And the process itself was quite adapted. So I've already talked about the recruitment. Everything that was jury facing was accessible. So information sheet, consent forms, meeting minutes, group rules, everything was in Easy Read format, video format or audio format. We also decided to put in a lot of time prepping this group for the citizens' jury. So we didn't just show up and have a citizens' jury. We had about 6 months of work to get there. So we did 5 preparatory workshops to build confidence and knowledge and trust within the group and to build a foundation of what health research is before we could really talk about what we thought about it. We reduced the length of the meetings, we had lots of shorter activities and breaks. We used communication supports such as the talking mats, but also green and red, I want to speak and I need a question cards, which helped a group that hadn't worked in a group before to understand when they needed to pause and listen to each other. Our expert witness testimony was adapted and made accessible, and we supported our expert witnesses to do that. And we gave lots of facilitation support for the group to deliberate and to come up with questions. So we hit pause during the process quite a lot. We're just going to hit pause on this, get into smaller groups and really hash out what we think is happening here and come up with some good questions. So we hit pause a lot to allow that. We ran a parallel process for people with profound learning disabilities that I don't have a lot of time to get into today, but it's in the evaluation. It's definitely worth looking at. Everyone in our group was verbal. Everyone in our group was able to engage in deliberation in that sort of context. We knew we needed to talk to people with profound learning disabilities and their families, so we actually ran a separate process. We did not think the citizens' jury was the right forum for that, so we ran a separate workshop where we distilled our question really small and worked with parents and families, and did some sensory work with people with profound learning disabilities. The other thing we did differently is we allowed our jury to select their own question, in part because we don't know what this group wants to talk about. There's almost nothing known about the views of people with learning disability on health research. For us to set a question would have just effectively compounded all of those same inequalities and assumptions. So we asked the group after 4 workshops to develop what they wanted their jury question to be. So they chose this: how can people with learning disabilities influence health research, including what research is done and how it's done. And it was also a great practice for disagreement, deliberation, voting, how we felt about when our idea wasn't the winning idea. It was actually brilliant practice, and they were allowed to set their agenda. We had expert facilitators, so all of our facilitators working on this project had extensive experience of engaging with people with learning disabilities in groups, and that was vital. Everyone was trained in using the Talking Mats tool, which again is a visual communication tool which uses images and symbols to help structure conversation. And we all worked reflexively as a group, so we had lots of opportunities to debrief and talk about what's working and not working. And actually the notes from those sessions formed quite a bulk of the evaluation work we did, because it was us saying, I really think this fell apart at this point, I really think this went well, I'm noticing that. We also had a lot of facilitators, so our ratios never fell below 1 to 6 for facilitator to juror, but in the actual citizens' jury itself there was 9 jurors and 4 facilitators. So really quite a lot of facilitators in the room for the size of the group. In terms of the outcomes of the project itself, there was an overall improvement in the way that people reported their confidence in communication. So across the group, people said they were more confident in communicating in different ways, specifically more confident in doing the types of communication we expect to see at citizens' jury. So that was listening to views that are different from mine, was more confident, sharing my opinion was more confident as well, and asking questions was showing more confidence. So things that we would expect to develop through a citizens' jury anyway. They also rated higher knowledge of health research, so they said they knew more about health research concepts, and sometimes they actually knew more about what they didn't know. So they were noticing that, I thought, this idea was really simple, but it's more complicated than I thought. Which was a good sign to us that they were engaging with the content of the jury. It wasn't just about the experience of debate and deliberation, they were engaging in depth in the content. They developed very relevant and well-reasoned recommendations for health research that have been very well received by this community, which is what I think is another kind of measure of a good project outcome. People think that the recommendations are valid and reasonable. So that was something that we were quite excited about. Here a juror talked about the social element, being part of a group. She says she doesn't go to work, but she really felt part of a team. It was great for her self-confidence. For expert witnesses, they reported really good outcomes as well from being involved. Some of them felt quite a daunting process, quite difficult to have to distill expert testimony into something much more accessible. But here an expert witness reflects that the questions were insightful, they were basically based in emotion and personal experience, and they made this expert witness consider areas that they never really focused on. And we had a few people texting and emailing afterwards saying, I'm on the train home and I can't stop thinking about this one question. So there's an element where people were challenged to talk about their research or their expertise from a completely different perspective from before, because it was from that lived experience perspective. The key learning I'd like anyone to take away from this is that people with learning disabilities are unlikely to be represented in deliberative democracy unless we actively remove their barriers to participation and find them. And unless we start to think about every process as engaging and involving every ordinary citizen. So people with learning disabilities have full lives in every sphere of life. It's not just health that we should be thinking about engaging them in. Our group had different backgrounds, things like criminal justice, housing issues, parenting, things that would have brought that expertise to almost any forum. Deliberative processes can be adapted without losing their core principles. Our citizens' jury really looked like a standard citizens' jury. It was all the behind the scenes prep work that was a little bit different. We did not dilute the expertise. We did not stop with our standards of deliberation. You know, we really held to a high standard that all of the recommendations had to be well reasoned. And other regarding, which was something we pushed for, and we had a representative group. Lots of different backgrounds, lots of different age range. We believe that when given appropriate support, people with learning disabilities can engage in complex deliberation, and they actually have something extra to give to that deliberation. As one of our jurors puts it perfectly, you can watch a football game, but playing the game is totally different. That lived experience is what they brought to the process. Just briefly, next steps. We've reflected in a blog a little bit about the process. Our recommendations report is online, have a look. We will have a full process evaluation, including the evaluation from individual jurors, coming out in 2021. We're seeking ongoing funding to keep this moving forward, and we're supporting different deliberative processes across the UK to sort of learn from some of what we've learned. And yeah, we're continuing to invest in this network of brilliant deliberators, so people with learning disabilities who have this expert knowledge and this investment, so we want to keep them going as a group. Thank you.